Hello everyone, my name is Christopher Liam Rose. I'm an author, mentor, life coach, motivational speaker, evangelist, musician, and activist. In this audio and podcast, we're going to be sharing a message for the Spiritually Helping Other People podcast. I've created this podcast to inspire humanity to go through a spiritual change, to learn about Jesus Christ, Jehovah, and Buddha, to learn about spiritual change, and to learn more about the no self and selflessness and helping other people. Now, in this message, we're going to be talking about spiritual awakening. Now, spiritual awakening is very important in life, and all human beings must go through a spiritual awakening. A spiritual awakening is when you overcome the self to discover the no self, and you transform all your past life experiences into spirituality and faith. So you learn about your life experiences, and you learn about your trauma, your successes, your failures, what you've been through as a human being, and your challenges within life. Now, in spiritual awakening, we must go through the spiritual practices to obviously discover the spiritual awakening. So what are the 5 spiritual practices we need to do? Prayer, meditation, mindfulness, walking, and journaling. If we do the 5 spiritual practices, we'll go through a spiritual awakening. Prayer and meditation and mindfulness really connects us to Jesus Christ, Jehovah, and Buddha. And Jehovah, Jesus Christ, and Buddha want you to go through a spiritual change. They want you to discover the spiritual awakening, and they want you to help other people, help the animals, help the universe. It's very important to realize, and it's very important to learn that the spiritual awakening becomes the most important thing. As human beings, we're meant to change and transform and evolve. Every day as we live our lives, we're meant to be evolving, transforming, and changing. So it's important that we go through a spiritual change, and that we help other people, give back, help the animals, and help the universe. Now, the spiritual awakening is the no self and selflessness and spiritual change. When you discover the no self and selflessness and spiritual change, you'll be doing the work of helping other people, helping humanity, helping the universe. Now, the no self and selflessness is very, very important to discover spiritual awakening. If we don't overcome the self, which is where suffering, pains, and adversities come from in life, we can't discover the no self and selflessness. And if we can't discover the no self and selflessness, it means we haven't gone through a process of spiritual awakening or spiritual change. So to discover spiritual awakening, we need to go through a spiritual change. When you go through a spiritual change, your psyche and your psychological mind changes. So your mind will be focused on helping other people, helping the animals, helping the universe, helping the creation of what Jehovah has given to us. Now, the spiritual awakening takes time to really discover. You're not going to discover it in a day. It takes months, years, weeks, and a lot of time to discover it. But you have to go on the journey. You have to go through the process. You have to overcome the self to discover the no self and selflessness. Now, the spiritual change becomes the most important thing. You must go through a spiritual change, and it's very, very difficult to go through a spiritual change, especially when you've gone through trauma, life experiences, and difficulties. But without the spiritual change, you can't discover the spiritual awakening. And the spiritual awakening transforms your psyche and your psychological mind from the self to the no self, which is a spiritual change that we need to go through in life. Now, each human being has the opportunity to spiritually change, but it's something we have to make a choice about, and it's something we have to make a decision to do. It's very important that we realize that spiritual awakening is part of spiritual change, and if we don't go through a spiritual change, we can't go through a spiritual awakening. So it's very important You do the 5 spiritual practices: prayer, meditation, mindfulness, walking, and journaling, to discover spiritual change and spiritual awakening. Now, what happens when you go through a spiritual change and a spiritual awakening is that your whole mind, your psychological mind, your psyche will change. When your psyche changes and your psychological mind changes, which is basically your thinking patterns and your thoughts and your behavior, your characteristics, qualities and personality and mentality, when that all changes into faith and spirituality, then your whole life changes. And then when your whole life changes, you're not the same person you was before. The way you live your life will be completely different to how it was before. It'll be more focused on helping other people, helping the animals, helping the universe, and helping the Lord Jehovah's creation. And obviously, when you go through a spiritual change and a spiritual awakening, you'll start to connect to faith and spirituality and build a relationship with Jesus Christ, Jehovah, and Buddha. So it's very, very important we go through a spiritual change and a spiritual awakening. And spiritual awakening takes time. It takes time to discover yourself as a human being. When you learn to know self and selflessness, that means you know thyself. And know thyself basically means you understand yourself as a human being. You know what your life experiences are. You know what you've been through. You know what you've overcome. You know how difficult your life has been, but you've overcome it. And you know the freedom from the known, which basically means freedom from daily conflicts and daily suffering, pains and adversity. So it's important to go through a spiritual awakening. It's important to go through a spiritual change. I would recommend to the listeners and viewers do the 5 spiritual practices: prayer, meditation, mindfulness, walking and journaling. Once you've done the 5 spiritual practices and gone on the journey of a spiritual change and a spiritual awakening, then do the 5 levels of helping other people. Level 1, volunteering. Level 2, jobs, careers, employment. Level 3, business, entrepreneurship. Level 4, faith and spiritual. Level 5, spiritually helping other people who helping other people. And go on the journey of helping other people, giving back and making a difference. The spiritual awakening makes you more kinder, caring, compassionate, empathetic towards others. And the spiritual awakening is life's transformation. If we don't go through a transformation within the psyche and the psychological mind and go through a spiritual change, then we can't discover our spiritual awakening. And then when you go through a spiritual awakening, you learn about the no self and selflessness. And when you know about the no self and selflessness, you're understanding yourself as a human being, because it's know thyself. And then you find spiritual freedom and spiritual liberation once you know yourself and understand yourself. So I hope this has helped. I hope you'll go through a spiritual change. Remember, spiritual awakening comes from doing the 5 spiritual practices: prayer, meditation, mindfulness, walking, journaling, and also doing the 5 levels of helping other people. And once you've gone on the journey, you'll see that spiritual awakening has been the most important thing. And when you go for a spiritual awakening, your life changes. Your whole life changes, because when you change your thinking, you change your life. When you spiritually change your thinking, you spiritually change your life. So it's very important to go on the journey of spiritual change and spiritual awakening. And then once you've gone on the journey and you've understood yourself, help other people in what they go through, give back and make a difference. So thank you for listening. Hope this has helped. Bye now. Take care. Bye now. Thanks.